This is a response to a YouTuber named Epydemic 2020. Epydemic has made several videos regarding objective morality, including one titled Euthyphro Dilemma. I put a link to his video in the description box. In his video, Epydemic attempts to demonstrate that the Euthyphro dilemma is actually a false dilemma, as a third option exists. Epydemic states that objective morality neither exists outside of God or is a result of God's commands. To him, objective morality flows from the nature of God himself. This video will attempt to demonstrate why I don't believe this third option exists. I will do this by discussing Yahweh's command to exterminate the Canaanites. Deuteronomy 7:1-2 says, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally, make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy." Now, in case there is doubt as to what is actually meant by the phrases, "you must destroy them totally" and "show them no mercy," Deuteronomy 20:16-17 says, "However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you." The argument offered by many apologists to defend Yahweh's genocide command goes something like the following. Premise 1, Yahweh exists and is morally perfect. Premise 2, Yahweh would not command the Jews to exterminate the Canaanites unless he had a morally sufficient reason for doing so. Premise 3, Yahweh commanded the Jews to exterminate the Canaanites. Conclusion, Yahweh had a morally sufficient reason for commanding the extermination of the Canaanites. I reject this argument not as logically impossible, but as unlikely, and to demonstrate this, I would like to directly target premise 2 as false. Many may argue that, although Yahweh had morally sufficient reasons for commanding genocide, reasons that are wholly consistent with his perfect goodness, they may be too difficult for us to understand. I reject this argument as the Old Testament itself has a lot to say about what Yahweh's reasons were, and they are not too complicated or mysterious for us to understand. I will address each of the common arguments given and why I believe they are not persuasive. A common argument offered in support of the morality of genocide states that the Canaanites were destroyed because of their great depravity. Some apologists have attempted to demonstrate the depravity of the Canaanites by referencing Abraham's negotiation with Yahweh regarding the destruction of Sodom. Since Yahweh was willing to save Sodom if even 10 innocent persons were found, surely this shows the incorrigible wickedness of the Canaanite culture. To evaluate this argument, we must first examine the wickedness of the Canaanite culture to determine if a morally sufficient reason to command genocide can be found. So, what was the incorrigible wickedness of the Canaanites? Leviticus 18:19-25 seems to imply that the Canaanites were guilty of the following: having sexual intercourse with women during their periods, having sexual intercourse with the wives of their neighbors, participating in homosexual behavior. I might point out that some argue that this reference doesn't specifically refer to homosexuality per se, but only in the context of male temple prostitution, bestiality, and sacrificing some of their children to the god Moloch. We don't know exactly how these things ranked in terms of seriousness, but Leviticus states that it was for these reasons that the Canaanites were going to be driven out. 4 of these abominations are sexual in nature. However, none appear to be uniquely Canaanite. In fact, all have been practiced since the Canaanite culture, and some even still today. Is there any reason to believe that these were more common among the Canaanites than other cultures? And even if they were, is this a morally sufficient reason to exterminate the Canaanites? If these were the only items of which the Canaanites were guilty, I believe that most reasonable people would conclude that they do not offer a morally sufficient reason to destroy an entire race of people. The most serious charge against the Canaanites is sacrificing their children to the god Moloch. It is believed that this sacrifice involved the burning of children. Obviously, we all agree that sacrificing children is a heinous act. However, we must determine whether or not Yahweh and the Jews thought it was. Was the act of sacrificing a child an abomination in and of itself, or only an abomination when it was performed to gods other than Yahweh? Leviticus 18:21 says, "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Moloch, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." An interesting point regarding the command that forbids sacrificing children to Moloch is that the command does not stand on its own. Instead, it is linked with profaning the name of Yahweh. One could conclude that it wasn't child sacrifice specifically that was an abomination, but only when performed to a god other than Yahweh. There is additional evidence that has led some to conclude that during this time, the Jews might actually have considered child sacrifice to be a viable way to please Yahweh. Exodus 22:29 through 30 says, "You must give me the firstborn of your sons. Do the same with your cattle and your sheep. Let them stay with their mothers for 7 days, but give them to me on the 8th day." Notice that the giving of firstborn sons to Yahweh was to be done just like cattle and sheep. The most natural way to interpret this verse is a prescription for sacrificing one's firstborn son. Exodus 13:2 says, "Consecrate to me every firstborn male. The offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether man or animal." Although the verse says to consecrate the firstborn male, it is fair to note that the method for consecration isn't described. However, it was the same regardless of whether it was man or animal. Exodus 34:20 says, "The first offspring of every womb belongs to me, including all the firstborn males of your livestock, whether from the herd or flock. Redeem the firstborn donkey with a lamb. But if you do not redeem it, break its neck. Redeem all your firstborn sons. No one is to appear before me empty-handed." Notice that the firstborn sons are to be redeemed, apparently by the substitute sacrifice of an animal. But redeemed from what? The most straightforward answer is not redeemed from service to Yahweh, as some apologists have stated, but rather redeemed from having to be sacrificed. I'm not suggesting that the Jews actively participated in child sacrifice, but am simply suggesting that, at this time, their beliefs regarding it were evolving. I do not believe they viewed it as the abomination that some apologists suggest. Further evidence which shows that during this early period, the Jews thought that the sacrifice of a child might win them favor with Yahweh is found in the story of Jephthah. As you know, in order to defeat the Ammonites, Jephthah vowed that whatever came out of the doors of his house would be Yahweh's and would be sacrificed as a burnt offering. Yahweh honored Jephthah's request, and when he returned victorious, his daughter was the first to come out of the house to meet him. After allowing her to weep with her friends for 2 months because she would never marry, Jephthah offered her as a burnt offering. One thing that is often overlooked in this story is that Jephthah was a judge of Israel. If Yahweh had made it abundantly clear that one of the reasons the Canaanites were driven out of their land was because of child sacrifice, Jephthah would surely have known about this and wouldn't even have considered his daughter to be a viable option for sacrifice. I believe there is good evidence to show the Jews did not believe that Yahweh considered child sacrifice to be immoral, but only when used in worship to other gods. So we must consider this question. If it's moral to sacrifice children to Yahweh, would it be immoral to sacrifice them to other gods? I will assume that my viewers will conclude that this is a ridiculous question and find both acts immoral. However, there is no reason to conclude that Yahweh or the Jews did. Although I feel I have offered a good argument for why the acts of the Canaanites do not offer a morally sufficient reason to command genocide, I will continue the argument for those who are not persuaded. Let's assume for the moment that child sacrifice is an act that warrants genocide. Would this still be the most moral thing to do? Or would it be more consistent with a morally perfect being to find another alternative? In the book of Jonah, we read that Nineveh was a very wicked city. Perhaps they were as wicked as the Canaanites. However, in this instance, Yahweh sent Jonah to preach to them, and the entire city was saved. Here, Yahweh showed great compassion to the people. In fact, Yahweh's very own words were, "But Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and many cattle as well. Should I not be concerned about that great city?" If Yahweh sent a prophet like Jonah to Nineveh, why didn't he send one to the Canaanites? Some apologists will argue that even if a prophet like Jonah was sent, the Canaanites still wouldn't have repented. The response leaves me unsatisfied. Surely, if Yahweh was powerful, he could have accomplished his purpose if he really wanted to. For those who are convinced that Yahweh had a morally sufficient reason for commanding genocide, and that the Canaanites would not have repented even if a prophet such as Jonah was sent, I will offer one further argument. Even if we stipulate that the Canaanites were incorrigibly wicked and would not have repented under any circumstance, was it necessary to kill the children? One justification offered by apologists is to basically state that they were collateral damage in a just war against evil. However, this argument hardly requires a rebuttal. When one reads the text, it is difficult to understand how an honest individual would deny that not only were children killed, but they were explicitly one of the targets of the soldiers. Like their parents, they were to be destroyed without mercy. A second justification offered for killing the Canaanite children is to say that the children went to heaven immediately upon death. The argument is that this is far better than allowing them to grow up and be as wicked as their parents, only to end up in hell. The act of killing the Canaanite children before they could be corrupted really demonstrates how merciful Yahweh is. I think we can all see the ad hoc nature of this claim. It's a nice thought, but what evidence is there to support it? Who knows if the Canaanite children would have grown up wicked, especially if they had been adopted by Jews and trained in the teachings of Yahweh? Additionally, how do Christians know that all children go to heaven upon death? There is little, if any, scriptural support for this claim. Instead, it appears that this has been created for two reasons. First of all, to alleviate God from any responsibility for not allowing children the opportunity to choose him, and two, as a way to comfort parents who are dealing with the death of a child. If you are like me, the arguments offered by apologists fail to demonstrate what they intend, that the command to exterminate the Canaanites was morally justified. And if the genocide command was not moral, then objective morality cannot flow from Yahweh's nature. To all my viewers, let me know what you think. Thanks for listening.